Judge Eleanor Whitmore had sentenced hundreds of men in her career. But on that Tuesday morning, as the bailiff called the next case, something stopped her. The defendant walked in wearing a plain and simple shirt. Tall, calm, familiar. She looked at his face, and everything around her fell quiet. It had been almost 40 years. She used to know that face. Once, she danced with him under paper streamers and borrowed lights. And now, she held the power to take away his freedom. Marcus Taylor was 53 old, a carpenter by trade, a father to a little boy who loved baseball and messy science projects. Marcus wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. But he was known in his neighborhood for his honesty, for always finishing a job even when the client couldn't pay on time. He had grown up in the same town where he now stood trial, a place where everyone knew everyone. But some things were never talked about. When Marcus was a teenager, he went to the same high school as Eleanor Whitmore. Back then, she was Eleanor Price. She was smart, ambitious, voted most likely to succeed. Marcus was quieter, good with his hands, always drawing plans for houses. He dreamed of building one day. Their paths crossed at a dance. Senior year, he asked her to the prom. She said yes. No one made a big deal of it, at least not out loud. But Marcus remembered the looks, the way teachers avoided their eyes. He remembered the letter left in his locker the next day. No name, just a warning. Stay where you belong. Marcus never talked about it again, and neither did Eleanor. Life moved forward. She went to law school. He stayed behind, building houses and saving what he could. Now, years later, they were back in the same room. But it wasn't a dance floor. It was a courtroom, and Eleanor wasn't the girl he remembered. She was a judge deciding his fate. Marcus Taylor was arrested on a rainy Thursday in March. The charge, armed robbery of a liquor store on the edge of town. There were no fingerprints, no usable DNA. The security footage was grainy, and the clerk couldn't say for sure if it was him. But Marcus was a black man, and he was nearby. That was enough. He had never been in trouble before. Not in high school, not in college, not during the years he spent tutoring kids in after-school programs. But now, at 53, Marcus was in a holding cell waiting to be arraigned. He said the same words he'd say over and over again. I didn't do this. His public defender was polite, overworked, and brief. He called it an unfortunate misunderstanding. The evidence is thin, he said, but the jury pool's tough. We should think about a deal. Marcus shook his head. He wouldn't plead guilty to a crime he didn't commit. Outside the courthouse, a local news outlet posted his mugshot. The headline read, "Architect charged in armed robbery." No mention of the mentorship awards. No mention of the youth centers he helped design. Just a photo. Another man in a jumpsuit. Inside the courthouse, people move around as they always had. Lawyers, clerks, bailiffs. The docket was full. No one was looking for a deeper story. Until the case reached Department 4. The judge's name was printed on the folder, Eleanor Whitmore. She didn't recognize it at first. But when Marcus entered the courtroom and their eyes met, she hesitated. Just for a moment. That moment didn't go unnoticed. She asked the clerk to repeat the name, Marcus Taylor. He didn't look at her with anger. He didn't look at her with fear. He looked at her like he already knew this was going to happen. The courtroom sat in silence as Marcus Taylor was sworn in. His voice was steady. His eyes didn't wander. He gave his name, his date of birth, his profession, architect, he said. He didn't say he'd once been on the cover of a community magazine, or that he'd won 2 awards for design innovation. He knew what mattered now was the charge. Judge Whitmore watched him closely. She asked procedural questions, neutral by the book, but her hands were tighter on the bench than usual. She remembered him, not just from the hallway glances or high school corridors. From prom night, she wore a pale blue dress. He wore a rented tuxedo that didn't quite fit. They danced once, maybe twice, then walked to the edge of the gym floor. She remembers how he drew her house on a napkin. 2 floors, 3 bedrooms, a big window facing the trees. He said he wanted to build something real one day. And now Nearly 4 decades later, she was being asked to decide if he would ever walk free again. She didn't tell anyone about the past. Not the clerk, not the attorneys. She thought she could keep it separate, but it was already inside the room. The prosecutor presented the case as open and shut. A store had been robbed. A man matching Marcus's height and build had been seen leaving the scene. A partial shoe print was found. They played the surveillance footage. The figure in the video moved quickly, face obscured. The clerk said it might be Marcus. That word, might, never seemed to matter as much as it should have. His defense attorney tried to push back, offered time-stamped text messages from Marcus's phone, showed location data from an app, but the signal dropped out briefly in the area near the store. That window, 9 minutes, became the prosecution's entire case. Jurors shifted in their seats. Some stared harder than others. In the gallery, a few people whispered. Marcus sat quietly, answering when asked. He did not cry. He did not shout. He did not plead. He said, "I was at home. I was watching a video call with my nephew. They asked for proof." He said the call wasn't recorded. He asked them to check with his nephew, but the nephew was 10. The prosecution said that wasn't reliable testimony. Judge Whitmore allowed the objection. She didn't look up as she said it. The days passed quickly. Jury selection came and went. Of the 28 potential jurors, not one was black. The defense challenged it. The judge overruled. "Procedurally sound," she said. The words echoed longer than they should have. Marcus looked at her once. Just once. And she looked away. The trial moved forward. Witnesses were called. Exhibits submitted. Motions filed. On paper, it was ordinary, but it didn't feel that way. Not to Marcus, and not to Judge Whitmore. Each time Marcus stood to speak, Eleanor felt something shift, a weight she thought she'd buried decades ago. He spoke with care, never rushed, never angry. When asked if he'd ever been to the liquor store, he said no. When asked why his phone signal dropped, he said, "I don't control the towers." The courtroom laughed, but not kindly. A moment later, the judge reminded the room to remain quiet. She didn't smile. Marcus's nephew testified, a soft-spoken 10-year-old in a too-big suit. He said they were talking about his science project the night of the robbery. He said Uncle Marcus helped him draw a model of a bridge. The prosecutor asked what kind of bridge. The boy didn't know. The courtroom murmured again. The judge called for silence, but her voice had lost its sharpness. The defense introduced character witnesses, a retired teacher, a pastor, a former co-worker. All said the same thing. Marcus didn't belong here. But still, the evidence didn't go away. That blurry photo, that vague shoe print, the jury's uneasy glances. And then came the memory Eleanor hadn't wanted, the one she had kept away even from herself. She was 17. Her father was in the doorway. He had seen her with Marcus, walking home after school. He told her to end it, that if she kept seeing him, there would be consequences. He said people like Marcus didn't belong with people like them, and she had nodded. She remembered Marcus waiting for her at the bus stop the next day. She didn't show. He waited again the day after that, and then he stopped waiting. She never wrote, never called. She went to college, law school, passed the bar, and rose fast. When people asked about her high school years, she never mentioned him. And now, here he was back in her courtroom, the boy she left behind, wearing chains she could order removed. The lawyers debated a new motion. The defense wanted time to bring in a data expert. The prosecution objected, said it would delay the trial unnecessarily. Eleanor ruled in favor of the prosecution. Her voice didn't shake, but her hands were locked together beneath the bench. She told herself she was being fair. She told herself she was doing her job. But deep down, she knew something else. That fairness, real fairness, wasn't just about following rules. It was about knowing when the rules had been written with cracks already in them. Outside, the courthouse doors opened and closed. Reporters came and went. No one knew yet who Marcus Taylor had once been, or what he meant to the woman behind the gavel. But inside, she knew. And the next decision she made would carry more weight than any she had faced before. It was day 5 of the trial. The courtroom air had grown heavier, not from chaos, but from repetition, objections, overruled, evidence, circumstantial. A man's life reduced to documents in doubt. Judge Whitmore arrived that morning with a folder under her arm and her name on the docket, just as always. But something had changed. A note had been left on her desk. Short, handwritten, folded 3 times. It read, "You should step down. It's not too late to do the right thing." There was no signature, but she recognized the handwriting. Her daughter's. Claire Whitmore was 31 years old, a lawyer, a policy strategist, and for the past 4 years, the youngest woman ever to lead the Senate majority. She had spoken openly about race, about prisons, about how her mother had inspired her to study law. They hadn't agreed on everything, but they had stayed close. Claire wasn't supposed to be in the city that week, but as it turned out, she had watched a local news clip from the trial, and she had recognized a man in the defendant's chair. She had seen the old photos, heard the stories. The boy her mother had never spoken of out loud. She came to the courthouse without cameras. No aides, no press, just one woman walking up concrete steps to a building that still favored silence over honesty. Claire entered the courtroom during a break. She sat quietly in the back row, and when Marcus looked up and saw her, something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, recognition. She nodded once. Eleanor didn't see her at first, but when she did, it was like something long frozen inside her started to move. The next witness was called. The clerk began reading from a sworn statement. Cell tower analysis, signal triangulation, the kind of data that could have cleared Marcus's location if it had been allowed. And then Claire stood up, not with outrage, not with a speech. She simply approached the bench at the break and requested to speak, not as a senator, but as a citizen. The courtroom murmured. The judge paused. She allowed it. Claire stood at the podium and said, "This court has made no mention of conflict of interest, yet the presiding judge has personal history with the defendant." The room went still. The prosecutor objected. The judge overruled. Claire continued. The relationship was in high school, but it was formative and unacknowledged, and the silence around it has affected this trial. The clerk asked if she had legal standing. She said she wasn't here as counsel. She was here as a witness to her mother's own past and to the system that now risks repeating it. Eleanor didn't respond at first. She stared down at her bench, her fingers pressed together, her chest barely rising. Then, in a voice quieter than any she'd used before, she said, "This court will recess until 2 p.m. And she left the room. Outside, reporters were already gathering. The courtroom buzzed. Marcus sat still. Claire remained in her seat. Neither of them said a word. But something had shifted. The trial was no longer just about guilt or innocence. It was about memory, about power, about whether silence, the kind that hides in routine, would be allowed to win again. Court reconvened after lunch. The judge returned to the bench, her robe perfectly pressed. Her voice, this time, just a bit less guarded. Claire was no longer in the room, but her presence had done what years of silence could not. It opened the door. Eleanor Whitmore took a long pause before speaking. Then she addressed the court. "Before we proceed, I have a statement. This will be part of the official record." No one moved. She continued. "The defendant and I attended high school together. We knew each other. And though we have not spoken in decades, I recognize now that this prior relationship should have been disclosed at the outset of this trial. My failure to do so was not intentional, but it was wrong. I am recusing myself effective immediately." There was no outburst, no applause, just stillness, the kind that follows a shift too big to reverse. The next day, a new judge was assigned. The defense was granted a continuance. With that time, new evidence was reviewed. An expert testified that the phone data had been misread. The time window, the 9-minute gap, was a miscalculation. Marcus hadn't been near the store. He was home, on a call with his nephew. The timestamp matched. The store clerk withdrew their testimony. I wasn't sure anymore, they said. I never really was. The prosecution dropped the charges. Marcus Taylor walked out of court a free man. No apology, no parade, just air and space, and the quiet sound of steps returning to solid ground. A few days later, Eleanor Whitmore submitted a letter to the state bar. She stepped down from the bench. In the letter, she wrote, "Justice isn't a robe. It's the willingness to see clearly, even when it costs you something." She did not give interviews. She did not ask for praise. She called Marcus once. He answered. They spoke for 12 minutes. She told him she remembered the napkin, the house he drew. He said he had built that house for someone else. Then he paused and said, "I never wanted revenge. I just wanted the truth to matter." Claire went back to Washington. She introduced a bill the next week, focused on mandatory judicial disclosures in state trials. It passed the following year. No headlines mentioned Marcus by name, but the change had his fingerprints on it. The case never made national news. It was just another trial. Another black man almost buried by the system. Almost. What stopped it wasn't a miracle. It was a memory, a daughter, a truth that refused to stay quiet, and a judge finally willing to say, "I was wrong." And maybe, just maybe, that's what justice looks like. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. If you were Judge Whitmore, would you have stepped down? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters.